One of the things which we've had with some of the charismatic churches is that the media have taken an interest in the amount of money which is going into the organisation. And because of our transparency, it will be the media that will do some of that work. And if necessary, they will come to us with a complaint.
So there is a capacity there to say, well, in considering whether there's a public benefit, do you consider the level of donations and their income and the public works that they do? Is there a balancing act there?
No, well, a church doesn't have to do, if you like, public good. I think you have to separate out between the welfare work that a church might do, or educational work or whatever, and the work it does solely for its religious purposes. So I think there's sometimes a confusion between that. We will look at income and so on. I'd also have to say that it's pretty early days. Many of these organisations are simply putting in their first annual returns now, and so we haven't developed a pattern with this. But any member of the Australian public can go onto our register, could have a look at any church in New Zealand and have a look at its income and expenditure and its activities. So you could do that now. Now, I can't imagine many Australians having a particular interest in doing that, but a New Zealander could look at a church, any church, and say, we have concerns about it. You know, maybe we gave this amount of money, we can't see where that's in these books. Or they've said that there's no expenditure, but we know money's going overseas. So we as an organisation have got the power to go in and carry out a more detailed investigation if that was warranted. Or we could refer it to the police or Serious Fraud Office or any other agency.
Can I just, and I'm concerned about time, a couple of other issues. If an organisation which is claiming tax-free status, whether it's a religion or a charity, says that they are charging very high fees in order to be to understand or to achieve further levels in that religion,
yeah.
Is that something that concerns you, or there's a fair degree of latitude for that religion to charge what fees it wants, or is that part of the test that you consider?
Well, I can sort of see where you're heading here, so let me just keep it slightly more general. One of the things we would say as part of a public benefit is that the public should have a reasonable opportunity to get a benefit from the charity, and the charging of fees is something which may hinder that ability. So, for example, and we register sports organisations, there's a difference between golf in terms of some places you could go, it's $500, and we'd say, well, look, that's probably reasonable, but someone charged $20,000, we would say, well, the public doesn't have a reasonable opportunity to be able to participate, so we wouldn't register that. Now, if you bring that into the church environment, that may well be something that we would have to take into account.
So that's one of the issues. So you look at the commercial structure, if you like, of the organisation.
Yes. In other words, if you had a church which, for various reasons, cost being one, made it difficult for people to participate, then we would see that the public benefit was hindered there. And
so if an organisation is saying this is a path to enlightenment, or as a lot of faiths do, but there are enormous fees involved, that would be a negative factor in terms of whether it should receive tax-free status.
Could well be, yes.
Thank you.
Senator Stevens?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Garrett, how does the New Zealand Commission deal with international organisations?
Well, we will register them, but what we look at is the extent to which we're able to enforce any of our provisions within New Zealand, which means that they'd normally have to have an office there or something like that. That's the first thing. Secondly, for tax purposes, if they're operating overseas, then they need to get special provision from Inland Revenue, which is done by separate Act of Parliament.
Okay.
So I think they're probably the main things. We have turned down some international organisations, but most of that has been because they've operated overseas with no real base in New Zealand. We've looked at some organisations which are Australasian, and we've looked at, again, whether we can enforce the law in New Zealand or whether it's reliant on Australia. But so no, we've registered an awful lot of organisations. I think we've got something like 2,500 charities which provides international services.
Okay. And the Commission was actually established by a new Act of Parliament in New Zealand, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
So I'm sure you're aware that we've been having this debate here in Australia for quite a long time, and got to the stage where there was a draft charities bills proposed in 2004, and that most recently the Henry review of the Australian taxation system recommended a Modern Charities Act. Do you think that the Act that you are currently operating under actually clarifies some of the complexity around charity law?
Probably not. I mean, I have to say, when I got asked to set this organisation up, and I was really in the sport and recreation sector, I sort of thought charity was really quite narrow around the welfare area. And I think that's sort of a popular understanding of what charity is. And yet when you look at it, it's incredibly broad. We've sometimes thought about the fact that, you know, you've got this piece of legislation from the 1600s. What relevance does that have, and should we change it? But as we've worked through the process, I've probably got a feel that you're not going to make it any simpler by changing the definitions. I think the UK people have tried to by saying, look, these are things which may be charitable, and so I think that's helpful. But what we find, and you'll find it here too, is that one's perception of charity changes over time, and something which was charitable 50 years ago is now no longer charitable. So you still have to have a system by which you're able to constantly respond to the needs and requirements of modern society. And I'm not too sure how today you can somehow do that in a way which is going to be just as accessible in another 20 or 30 years' time. So, for example, sport. In the 1800s, sport was considered not to be charitable because it was entertainment for the aristocracy. Whereas now we see sport as something which is really important for public health and is used for education. And it's on that basis that we've reviewed how we deal with that. So it's having an ability to make those changes.
And just a final question, if I may, Chair. The issue of deregistering an organisation, how many of those have you done since?
Well, quite a
the register was
few.
established?
It might be up around the 800 to 1,000 over the past year or so. But I'd have to say that most of those are because either the organisation doesn't send in its annual returns, and we will deregister them. They've gone belly up, in which case we want to take them off the register, so the register is up to date. And we've probably dealt with only about a dozen organisations where we have decided that that what they were doing was not what they told us that they were going to do. And we've had some where we think there's fraud going on, and so we've deregistered them for financial mismanagement.
Okay.
So there's a range, but again, I'd have to caution all that by saying we finished registration of the big bulk last year, and we've only just received the first of the annual returns for every organisation.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Yes.
Thank
you, Senator. Senator
Yes,
go ahead, then
sorry,
Senator Cameron.
if I just ask further that. So at the moment, the criteria for a public benefit test, you look at the issue of, you can look at the potential issue of harm as well.
Yes.
And is it evolving at the moment because it's relatively new? I mean, do you rely on common law precedents, or how do you determine it?
Well, some common law. I mean, you raised the a question of a previous group about the ease of being able to leave an organisation.